Welcome to our new video about the ATSDB version 04. In this video I will showcase the Asterix import and the first setup of the application. So let's say you've visited our homepage, the GitHub page, and downloaded the latest releases, so the app image and the user manual. Hopefully you have read the user manual at least to some part. And then what you're going to start with is the app image and an Asterix recording. In this case, this is a final format recording of 24 hours of the Malta air traffic service. So very many thanks to them for supporting us and allowing us to showcase our application with their dataset. This is much appreciated. So you start basically with the app image. As explained in the user manual, you have first to add the executable flag to it to be able to execute it, and that's it. And then you can start the application. First, you are met by the management screen, where you can first select which data to use, and you can start importing data, for example. So you've started with a new configuration, nothing is set up, and what you want to do first is just load an Asterix recording. To do that, I would recommend using an SQLite container, as it is selected by default. Then you create a new database. So for example, the file name of the recording that you want to load with a different extension DB for database. Then you can open this database. Now this is of course empty. First you want to import your data. This can be done using a task which is available after opening the database, and here you see the import Asterix data task. When clicking that, you're shown the import Asterix data window, where you can first select which files you want to import. So let's click add on that, add the final format recording that we have, it shows up, and then we can select the content of the data. Basically we configure the decoder that we're going to use, which is JAsterix. IOSS framing is fine. You would have the other options of no framing, so netto or raw, however you want to call it, or RFF, or in our case, IOSS final format. Then you can select which categories you want to import and what editions of these categories exist. I could go into more detail here, but I want to give a short summary of what you can do in the beginning. So basically you select your editions when they are available. If not, contact me at atsdb@gmx.at. And basically we are done. We can select import. Just a small hint. Currently not all of the data from Asterix is imported into the database. If you want to know more, you can, for example, select an JSON object parser and then find out which data items and which values are mapped to which database content. And basically everything else is disregarded at the moment. This will be changed in the future, of course. So we click on import, and then the import screen is shown. So here you see which file you're importing, the final format file, the elapsed time in seconds, minutes, and so on, how many frames have been read, so in this case we of course have frames, how many records were in those frames, then counter by category. So we can see we have category 34 and 48, so radars, categories 62 and 63 and 65, so system trackers. The mapped indication is how many JSON Asterix reports are mapped to database content. In all of the configurations, we can say which values are mandatory so that it can be correctly mapped to the database, and if it isn't mapped, or it was a category for which no mapping exists, then it is not mapped. So in this case, we skip, for example, all of the sensor status messages, which are mostly the not mapped parts here. This will of course be improved in the future. So for all that have been mapped, we create records, database records, which are then inserted. The record rate is the number of records which are inserted into the database. You get a status indication, how many have been read, how many have been inserted, and so on. But currently you just have to wait until we are done. After 4 minutes and 22 seconds, we are done. So about 4 million target reports have been added to the database with a rate of about 30,000 elements per second. The speed of your machine that you're going to use will vary. Please be aware that the application makes use of multiple cores. So I'm using in this case a quad-core computer with hyperthreading. Okay, now the Asterix import process has been done. At this point, I recommend closing the application once, because currently there exists a mem leak, and I would recommend just closing it once and then starting it up again. So, after restart, everything has been saved, which you did before. So you still have the database that you previously created selected. Now you can see also the database schema is not in an orange color anymore, which means there exists data in the database, which can be correctly loaded by the currently defined ATSDB schema. Now let's have a look at the data sources, because you have to configure them to be able to correctly inspect the data. So we said we have radar data and track data inside the database. We lock the schema, and then we have a look at what data sources exist. For this, you go into the Edit Database Object window and click on Edit Data Sources. Now, here we see 3 columns. One of them are the configuration data sources, the database data sources, and the defined actions. These are the data sources which were automatically created in the database during the import process. They have a SAGSIG, basically 2 trackers were active, and they have a name and a short name, in this case undefined. Since this is an example for a first import, you wouldn't have any data sources defined. Now, the first step would be to give your data sources meaningful names. And if you have radar data in there, which is the case in our example dataset, you have to set the latitude, longitude, and altitude of your radar data sources so that you are able to correctly calculate the radar plot positions. So let's have a look at that here. Here you see we have multiple data sources defined. And now I'm going to add the values which are needed to calculate the radar plot positions correctly. Now, I have added the information of all of the radars, so giving the names, the short names, giving the latitude, longitude, and altitude as meters above mean sea level. This is now defined in the database, so it will also be stored there. But I also want to synchronize it to the configuration. The configuration persists over multiple databases. And for example, if I wanted to import data from the same domain, so the same data sources, this would be then automatically be reused, and in the database, the data from the configuration would be stored. So I'm going to click Sync to Config, which then shows me from all of these data sources, no equivalent was found in the configuration. So the default action would be to add a data source to the configuration with a new identification. That's fine. I click Perform Actions, and they are then stored and persisted in the configuration. You only have to do this once. After all of your data sources are defined in a configuration, you don't have to revisit that steps ever again. So let's close those windows. Now, the data has been loaded, so imported from Asterix. The data sources have been defined. So the final step that we have to do is to calculate the radar plot positions, because they're only given in range and azimuth. And now with the configuration of the data sources, the VGS 84 positions, latitude, longitude, that are used in the application for display purposes can be calculated. So this calculate radar position plots task defaults to the RS2G projection, which is similar to the one used in ARTAS. So I would recommend using that one. You click on Calculate. The radar data is loaded from all of the sources, and the latitude and longitude positions are calculated and then reinserted into the database. This will take up to a minute or something like that. If there are projection errors, another window is shown where you are asked if you really want to insert the data and how many projection errors there existed and so on. Okay, now the plot position calculation was successful. It recommends to do a post-processing step. This post-processing step is done on new databases by default. So you don't have to set this post-processing. This is done automatically whenever you create a new database. Otherwise, if you re-import some data, you would have to check this box manually. Then we are done, and you can simply hit the Start button, which will then automatically trigger the post-processing, which can also take up to a minute or two. Okay. Now you're met with the management window of the database, which database objects exist, the database filter configuration, and so on. And then the OSGView. I'm just going to show the data that we've imported. So you hit the load button. No filters are active, so all of the data is loaded and then drawn in the OSGView. Here you have an indication what the database is doing, and here during the loading process the data is already shown. I'm going to do a more detailed video about the OSGView and especially the new features. I just want to showcase what this first looks like in the first import. So now here you have the trackers that were set up and the radars. In the next video, I will go into more detail about the usage, so how to load data in a more useful manner, and go over the new features in the OSGView. Thank you for your time.